Well, hello once again all my classic dirt bike YouTube fanatics, and thanks once more for tuning in to my video channel as we wind our way through the old classic dirt bikes of yesteryear and learn a bit more about what these ancient machines were actually like back in the day. Now, my next featured video is a very unique bit of kit, and more specifically the bike's chassis, which was built by yet another of Britain's great motorcycle engineers, Brian Curtis. So stick around for the next few minutes as we take a very brief look at a 1979 500 Curtis Honda. Now, Brian Curtis started Curtis Bikes in 1972 at the tender age of just 31. Now, Brian was a very famous motocross rider in the 1960s, although he then went on to build motorcycle frames with Don and Derek Rickman, who were also beginning to make their mark on the motorcycle world with their own brand of motocross and road racing frames. Now, later Brian Curtis would go on to manufacture his own motorcycles using Honda running gear, but this time in a frame and swing arm that was built by himself. Now, this particular machine at the time of taking this footage belonged to Scottish rider Dougie Harrow, although recently the bike has now been moved on to a new owner, as Dougie now owns a JBR Honda as his current race bike. But this particular machine was built by Brian Curtis in the late 1970s, and this is one of Brian's earlier bikes that he put together, as this frame was actually MIG welded rather than brazed, which were how many of Brian's later projects were constructed. Now, at the heart of many of Brian's creations was this well-proven and very reliable Honda XR500 power plant. Now, although naturally these Honda engines were designed in Japan, a very large percentage of these engines were actually assembled in many different countries around the world. Now, these XR500s were introduced in the late 1970s and were hugely popular, as they were initially launched by Honda as an engine in a road trail bike, although, as you know, it wasn't too long before riders were then removing the associated lights and other road-going peripherals and making these into full-blown off-road racers. Now, the engines are a single-cylinder 4-stroke with a 4-valve double overhead cam and a twin-port exhaust cylinder head. Now, these also had a 5-speed gearbox and your standard wet multi-plate clutch. Now, at the time, I think a standard XR500 motor put out about 36 horsepower, although there are many improvements like big bore kits and hot camshafts and larger valves that you can now buy for the cylinder head, available if you want to pimp up your 500 XR. These XR500s, of course, were then superseded by the bigger XR600F in 1985. Now, as you can see, a pair of American-made Fox front forks on this featured bike, which were considered excellent suspension systems for their time and were very popular among the motocross racers of their day. Now, a magnesium front brake backplate again on this bike, which looks like a genuine Honda item. And again, another set of quality made rear shocks by Works Performance from Alabama in California. Works Performance, of course, were started way back in 1973 by Gilles Villancourt. And these suspension systems have a very good reputation and certainly look the part fitted to this Curtis Honda. More magnesium used once again on this rear brake hub, which is more than likely to keep the overall weight of this big 4-banger down to as little as possible. Now in this shot we can have a look at that Brian Curtis designed rear swing arm and the cam plates for keeping the chain tension just right. But this Curtis made swing arm is a very nice piece of engineering, and all of this bike's chassis of course is handmade personally by Brian himself. As I mentioned previously, these XR500 motors were a single cylinder but had twin exhaust ports in the cylinder head with these two header pipes leading into this single exhaust, and then of course onto a big megaphone tailpipe at the rear, which gave this particular Honda a very decent bark when it got fired up. Now I'm almost certain that this nice fuel tank has been taken from a CR250 Honda, as these fuel cells are very popular parts to add to these kind of hybrid motorcycles, and they're widely used as substitutes when bike builders are putting together these kind of off-road specials. Now the bike seat is just one part that I'm not too sure of. Again, it could be from another Honda motorcycle, but could also be a custom made part for this particular bike. But either way, it still looks the goods, and it certainly doesn't look out of place on this Curtis 4-stroke machine. Now most of the bike's controls are your standard Renthal bars, grips and other associated levers, although the throttle is a very good quality Gunnar gasser to help you control the horses in that Honda 500 engine. But overall, this particular Brian Curtis Honda is still a very nice looking 4-stroke racer, and although many of Brian's later bikes with their more unique Braized frames have more allure and attraction to buyers of Curtis Hondas, this bike is nonetheless unique, as it has an earlier MIG welded chassis as opposed to the more desirable Braized items. Anyhow, since these clips were shot, this bike now has a brand new owner, and hopefully he or even she is enjoying this bike as much as Doogie did when he was racing this lovely bike with the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Club. But in terms of the bike's provenance, it's still a very collectible item because of its link with Brian Curtis. But then again, every other bike that Brian built in the past is very unique, because they were all conceived and constructed by his own fair hand, and that alone makes these bikes hugely sought after by vintage and classic dirt bike collectors across the globe. And so there you have it, a very nice and very rare Brian Curtis Honda from 1979. So thanks once again for tuning in, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel to see more of these old vintage iron motorcycles when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV. This video was brought to you in association with WorldSport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road and leisure sportswear. Just visit their online website for more information.